Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is Renewable Thermal Technologies in the Massachusetts APS. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance as part of the RPS Collaborative, and it is being hosted by Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CESA. Before I pass this over to Warren and to our guest speaker, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can either use your computer's mic and speakers, or you can call in using a telephone. If you'd like to minimize the webinar control panel that you see, you can click on this little orange arrow that we have circled here, and you can also use that arrow to expand the webinar console if you would like to. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and comments as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the questions panel on your webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions as they come in, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the webinar. We'll save about 15 minutes or so for a Q&A with the audience. And we do expect to get a lot of questions, so type yours in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email within about 48 hours with a copy of the webinar recording and the slides. And we'll also post those webinar materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon. Warren?
Hey, thank you very much, Samantha. Well, this webinar is being hosted by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we're a national nonprofit organization composed of state energy agencies and other public organizations interested in advancing clean energy across the country. And if you look at the slide on your screen, you can see the logos of our many members. And one of the activities we engage in, as you'll see in the next slide, is the RPS Collaborative. The RPS Collaborative is funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy, and the purpose of the collaboration is to allow state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and other individuals who are interested in renewable portfolio standards to exchange ideas, share information, learn from each other. And in addition to those networking activities, we produce reports, webinars, and events that seek to examine the challenges and solutions to implementing RPSs, and that seek to identify RPS best practices. We produce a monthly newsletter. We have webinars, as I indicated, and if you want to get on the mailing list for the newsletter and the announcements of our events, you can go to the website on the screen, cesa.org, and just look for Renewable Portfolio Standards, RPS Collaborative, and you'll find out how to get yourself added to our mailing list. Today, we're going to be focusing on the Massachusetts RPS, and if we could go to the next slide. And we're going to be hearing from Samantha Meserve, and we're going to be hearing about Massachusetts Renewable Thermal Program, which is an important innovation for that state. It's rolling out now, and you'll get to see how the whole program is going to work. Samantha is Renewable Thermal Program Coordinator for the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. She first began her career at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, administering the Solar Carve-Out 2 portion of the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard. And then she transitioned to working on the regulatory process for including renewable thermal technologies in the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard. So she's been living and breathing with the renewable thermal technology component of the state's APS for some time. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Environmental Resources Engineering from the State University of New York, their College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and she's currently working towards an MBA from the University of Massachusetts at Boston. So we're going to hear from Samantha, and then we'll have time for questions. So it's up to you, Samantha.
Thanks, Warren. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Like Warren mentioned, this is something that I myself and the whole team here at DOER has been working on for quite some time. So we're really excited that it's out in the world, and we're accepting applications, and we look forward to hopefully answering any questions that you have after the presentation. So just some background, the Massachusetts legislature passed an act in 2014, which added any facility that generates useful thermal energy using sunlight, biomass, biogas, liquid biofuel, or a naturally occurring temperature difference in ground, air, or water to the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard. And so after that law was passed, DOER began the rulemaking process. But then in 2016, the legislature passed an additional act to add fuel cells and waste to energy. So DOER, implemented those and kind of restarted the stakeholder process. So you can see here just a timeline. Like I mentioned, early 2014 and 2015, we began meeting with stakeholders to talk about this program. We drafted the initial version in spring of 2016, and then we filed a second draft in the spring of 2017 that incorporated all of the comments we had gotten from our first public comment session, and also that change that added fuel cells and waste to energy technologies. In October of 2017, we filed, DOER has to file all of their regulations with the legislature, the Joint Committee on Telecommunications Utilities, and energy, and so we filed with them, and then after we received their comments, we filed the final version with the Secretary of State's office on December 15th of last year, so it was promulgated on December 29th, and we began accepting applications just last week on December 16th. So just to recap, the renewable thermal technologies, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, that are eligible include air source and ground source heat pumps, solar thermal systems, liquid biofuels, biomass, biogas, and compost heat exchange systems. And then in addition, in this rulemaking, we also added non-renewable fuel cells and waste to energy for thermal purposes. So just some general program logistics. Any system that came online after January 1st, 2015 is eligible for the program. Systems that have been operating since January 1st, 2015 and meet all of our eligibility criteria are actually eligible to receive retroactive credits for that period, and they'll qualify all of that production during the Q4 2017 minting in April. All systems have to deliver a useful thermal load to Massachusetts, so they don't necessarily have to be located in Massachusetts. You could have a system that is maybe located right over the border, but as long as they're delivering a useful thermal load into the Commonwealth, they would be eligible. And any system which received 80% or more of their total construction and installation costs from either DOER or another state entity prior to the effective dates of the regs would not be eligible. And that's really just to prevent maybe over-incentivizing any projects that have already received a large chunk of funding from either DOER or the state. So one of the main components of this program is the size classifications, which really dictate how your system is going to be metered. So all renewable thermal technologies are divided into one of three size classifications, so small, intermediate, and large. I know this table is a little hard to read, but it just gives you kind of a breakdown of where we delineate between what needs to be metered and what doesn't need to be metered. So for solar thermal, it's about 660 square feet of collector area would be small. Anything between 660 and 4,000 would be intermediate, and anything over 4,000 would be large. And then for the air source and ground source heat pumps, anything below 134,000 BTUs per hour is a small system. Anything between 134 and 1 million BTUs per hour would be intermediate, and anything over 1 million would be large. And then for biomass systems, anything lower than 1 million BTUs would be intermediate. Anything over 1 million BTUs would be large. So you'll see that there's not always all three size categories. And an example of a reasoning for that is, for example, a solar sludge dryer. If that was to be classified as small, they wouldn't actually be doing any metering. Their certificates would be based off of a calculation, which for the other technologies we'll talk about later on. But we just don't know enough about that technology to feel comfortable doing a calculation. So we want them to be fully metering their system. So that's why they would only be classified as large. And just to back up a little, so small systems are doing no metering. All of their certificates are based on a formula that the department has established. An intermediate system is doing some sort of metering. So for example, a biomass system, they're not metering their useful thermal output, but they're metering their fuel input. And then a large system would be doing full useful thermal monitoring. So in addition to the size classifications, small systems, which are allowed to have their certificates calculated by a formula, also have the opportunity to pre-mint their certificates. And DOER defines pre-minting as you're eligible to receive 10 years of certificates up front. So for a lot of these small systems, they're not going to be getting a huge volume of AECs. And so if that were to be spread out over the lifetime of the system, they might, only be getting $100 or maybe even less a quarter or a year. It doesn't really have a meaningful impact on the system financials. So the idea is to give them 10 years of certificates up front, which really can immediately help drive down the capital cost of that system and have a larger financial impact. But DOER does recognize that having all of these small systems come into the APS and get 10 years of certificates up front could provide some supply issues in the market. So we have a provision where right now the APS is about 50% undersupplied. So you're seeing 50% of the compliance being settled with certificates and 50% being settled with the alternative compliance payment. If we were to get to a point where 75% is being settled with certificates and 25% is being settled with the alternative compliance payment, these small systems would switch from pre-minting to what we call forward minting, where they're still using the same formula to calculate the number of certificates they're getting, but instead of getting all of those certificates in one lump sum in the very beginning, they would get them over 40 quarters. So it still provides a lot of certainty as to the number of certificates you're getting, but it helps put the brakes on a lot of supply coming into the market, and it helps things stabilize. Because obviously if the market goes into a huge oversupply, you'll start to see that reflected in prices, and we wouldn't want the market to really bottom out because then, that's not useful to anyone. So this is really just to, put in a mechanism to make sure that supply isn't going to increase incredibly too much, and the market can't absorb that. And then one thing to just note, like I mentioned on the previous slide, biomass, biogas, and biofuel systems are only classified as intermediate and large, and these provisions are specifically for small systems. So biomass systems, even if they were to be residential scale, are not eligible for the pre-minting or forward minting. Additionally, we are, as laid out in the statute, we're able to give certain technologies certificate multipliers, and so that's any non-emitting renewable thermal technology. So again, that excludes the biomass, biofuel, and biogas systems. But for all other technologies, we're able to give them a multiplier. So typically you would see 3,412,000 BTUs be a megawatt hour equivalent, which would be equal to 1 certificate. But you can see here that for some technologies, they're actually getting more than that. So if you have an active solar hot water system used for domestic hot water, instead of getting 1 APE for your megawatt hour equivalent, you would be getting 3. And that's, again, just to recognize that the number of certificates these systems might be receiving, the financial value of that isn't quite meaningful enough to really drive the market to adopt these technologies. So by having these credit multipliers, again, you're really helping provide a more meaningful incentive. And you'll notice too, similarly to the size classifications, not all technologies have a multiplier at different levels. So it's kind of per technology, per size. In addition to those, any air source or ground source heat pump that is installed in an energy efficient building, a zero energy building, or a passive building is eligible for an additional multiplier of 2. So that would be added to the multiplier that we saw on the previous slide. So if you were in a ground source heat pump system and your multiplier was 5, but your system met the Department of Energy's definition of zero energy, your new multiplier would actually be 7. So that 2 is always added to the base multiplier. And this is really just to acknowledge that if you have a really efficient home, your heat load isn't going to be as high as if you had a not so efficient home, and so you might not be getting as much of an incentive, even though your system is costing the same. So this just helps, again, kind of provide an incentive for being a very energy efficient home, and potentially being net zero or a passive building. So going through the technologies, there's a lot of text on these slides. I'm probably not going to read all of them, but like Warren and Samantha mentioned, this should be available, and I can always provide more information if people have questions on specific technologies. So for air source heat pumps, the majority of the eligibility criteria pertain only to the small systems, and that's because we are using a formula to calculate their certificates. So, we made some assumptions when designing those formulas, and so in order to make sure that systems that are being installed are matching those assumptions, we have, a good amount of eligibility criteria. So, just to highlight, we have some COP requirements at different temperatures. If it's that you're installing air source heat pumps in a new construction building, it has to be doing 100% of the building's annual heating load, and you're not allowed to have any non-renewable heat sources. If you're installing in a retrofit, you can do 90% of the heat load, but it has to be between 90 and 100%. And it has to be integrated into the heating distribution system. So really, our incentive is targeting whole home solutions. We don't want people putting in an air source heat pump primarily just as a secondary source of heat or used for air conditioning. We're really targeting whole home solutions, and so that's where a lot of these requirements come from. One other thing to note is that for heat pumps, they're only getting certificates when they're in heating mode. They can be used for cooling, but they'll only get certificates for the useful thermal energy used for heating. For the large and intermediate heat pumps, there really aren't any requirements, and that's just because it's all production-based. So if you can install a system that is very inefficient and has a really low COP and make that work with your financials, then obviously we would hope that you would strive to do a more efficient technology, but we're not going to restrict that. So the small air source heat pump formula, this is an example here. So it's all based off of the size of the conditioned space. So for any building that's less than 1,500 square feet, it's a flat number of certificates. And that's because we recognize as you get down into smaller buildings, the price of your system isn't really dropping. There's kind of a bottom threshold for what your system will cost. And so we've set a similar bottom threshold for the number of certificates you would get. So if your building was less than 1,500 square feet, you would get 3 AECs per year times 10 years. And then at the bottom, you can see the different multiplier options. So for air source heat pumps, if you're doing less than 100% of your heating load, you would get a multiplier of 2. If you were doing 100% of your heating load, you would get a multiplier of 3. And for example, if you were doing 100% of your heating load and you were in an energy efficient or zero energy building, multiplier of 3, and then also another multiplier of 2. So you would be getting a total multiplier of 5, which would give you 150 certificates. If your building is larger than 1,500 square feet, the formula is still just based on the area of your building, but there's a little more that goes into it. So you can just see here an example of a 2,000 square foot building. You would plug that 2,000 into the formula for A, and that would result in 4 megawatt hours a year times 10 for your 10-year lump sum. And then again, same breakdown of the multipliers at the bottom of the screen. For ground source heat pumps, it tracks very similar to air source heat pumps. You can only receive AECs when you're in heating mode. There are a bunch of technical requirements, again, just as far as the assumptions we made into the formula, things like well, depth, all sorts of specifications you need to meet, which we think most people in the industry are doing already, but just again, as another layer of security for us. And you do have to be doing 100% of the building's total annual heat load. And then again, same thing, large and intermediate systems don't really have any of the above requirements. The formula for the small ground source heat pumps, very similar to the air source heat pumps, just some different coefficients. So you'll see for, if you're less than 1,500 square feet, you're getting 4.6 megawatt hours per year. So times 10 years would be 46. And then the multiplier for ground source heat pumps is 5. So you would be getting 230 certificates. If you were over 1,500 square feet, same formula, just different coefficients. So if you were doing a 2,000 square foot building, you would plug that 2,000 into as A. You would get 6.15 megawatt hours equivalents over 10 years, and then times your multiplier would result in 307 certificates. If you were getting that extra multiplier of 2, you can see at the bottom you end up with 430 certificates. And those are all given to you in that pre-minted lump sum. So you would get that right away and the first minting after you're qualified, and you would be able to sell that for a total lump incentive. Solar thermal systems, these really apply to all sizes. It has to be an active system, so you have to have some sort of pump or fan that's moving a fluid through the system. They have to have a performance specification, so we expect this typically to be OG 100 or OG 300. There's a couple different entities that we think we'll see primarily for rating to those specifications, but if there are other entities that get into this space, DOER can start accepting those based on a case-by-case basis. We don't allow unglazed flat plate collectors for pool heating. And that's just because from talking to the industry, those are really primarily only used for outdoor pool heating. And again, because we're targeting more whole home solutions, we really want to see people either using glazed flat plate collectors or evacuated tube collectors that maybe are heating their pool but are also tied into their home's domestic hot water or space heating system. And solar hot air systems are also eligible, but they have to meet all of the requirements that I stated above. So the formula for the small solar hot water systems, it has a few more inputs. It's based off of that rating that I mentioned on the previous slide. A surface orientation factor, which really just takes into account the azimuth and the tilt of the panels, and will derate based on it if you're deviated from kind of a perfect orientation for Massachusetts. And if there's any shading, it takes that into account, and then again, it's calculated over 10 years. So you'll see for here, if your rating was, say, 4,391 kilowatt hours per year, and then if you had, a perfect orientation, no shading, you're looking at around 43.9 megawatt hours equivalent per year, or for your 10 years, I'm sorry. And then with your multiplier, that's about 131 certificates that you would be getting in that lump sum. We have two formulas for small solar hot water just because you can use two different performance specifications. So this is very similar to the previous slide. I should mention the difference between OG 300 and OG 100. It's very similar, but OG 300 looks at a system. So the collectors, the piping, the tank, all of that, and it gives you an annual output. OG 100 is just looking at a single collector, and it gives you a daily rating. So that's just taken into account in this formula, but it tracks very similarly to the previous one. An example here, you can see we took the one-day rating and we converted it to kilowatt hours per year. If you're using 3 collectors, and then again, if you used a 1 for the surface orientation factor or 1 for the shading, 10 years, you're looking at about 73 megawatt hour equivalents, and then multiplied by your multiplier, you're looking at 220 AECs in that one first upfront minting. So liquid biofuels are defined in our definition as being created from organic waste feedstocks. And organic, that refers to, not USDA organic, but organic in that natural. And so we've kind of identified waste vegetable oils, waste animal fats, grease trap waste as some examples, but it could be other things if the feedstock are coming in and the biofuel industry is, coming to us. We can, we'll kind of decide on a case-by-case basis what we think should be eligible. They have to be at least a 10% blend. So right now, the heating oil industry is using about a 5% blend, where they're using 95% regular number 2 fuel oil and 5% biofuel. So really to try and push the market towards using more biofuel, they have to blend with at least 10%. So you can have 90% number 2 fuel oil and 10% eligible liquid biofuel, but you're only ever getting certificates for that eligible liquid biofuel. So the higher blend level you're using, the more certificates you'll get. And this liquid biofuels, it works a little differently than you would expect in most portfolio standards. So for large systems, it works the same, where the generation unit owner is being given the AECs. But for the intermediate systems, which we defined earlier as anything less than 1 million BTU per hour capacity, it would mostly be residential, small commercial. In most cases, those people aren't deciding what blend level they want in their fuel oil. There are some exceptions, but normally, they just need fuel and it gets delivered. So instead, in our program, for any of those intermediate systems, we're giving the certificates to the biofuel distributors. So whoever sells the biofuel onto an end user. And the idea there is they're the ones really making the decision about how much biofuel should be blended in and delivered to end users. So by shifting the incentive over to them, they're really the ones that are going to be the market changers and market drivers to get more biofuel used in the market. So they're the ones that would be getting the incentive. And then because we have one more provision about biofuel, and that's because so much fuel oil is used in Massachusetts, biofuel has an incredible potential to oversupply the market if there was to be a very fast pickup of eligible liquid biofuel. So in order to prevent that, we've put a cap on the total number of certificates that can come from biofuel. So this isn't a carve out. The certificates are all treated the same as, heat pump AECs and CHP AECs, but it's really just preventing them from coming in with a ton of supply and crowding out all of the other technologies that are eligible. So that's 20% of the compliance obligation from 2 years prior, which is always the most up-to-date information we have as far as compliance is from 2 years ago. So for the intermediate biofuel systems, these operate similarly to some of the small systems where the AECs are calculated based on a formula. So you'll see here it's based on the BTU content of the biofuel, which DOER has established as 127,000 BTUs per gallon, the volume of the fuel delivered, and then the blend content. So, that's really capturing that you're only getting certificates for the eligible liquid biofuel. And then the efficiency of the unit you're delivering to. So we've established this as 85% for boilers and 80% for furnaces. So an example here would be if you were selling 10,000 gallons of a B20 blend to someone with a furnace, you can see the calculation. It would end up in about 59 certificates that would go to the biofuel distributor. And again, this is just a little more on the cap, so it's always 20% of the obligation from 2 years prior, and 10% is allocated to the first half of the year and 10% is allocated to the second half of the year. That's to prevent the biofuel industry from coming in and really eating up that whole 20% in the first quarter. It helps spread it out over the whole year. And then if there was any remaining, so say in the first half of the year, there's 10% available. If they only are reported for 8%, that remaining 2% would roll over into the second half of the year. So they would have in quarter 3 and 4, they would have 12% of the cap available to them. If at any point the cap is reached, then everything's allocated on a pro rata basis. So you would still have an incentive to blend more biofuel, because the more biofuel you're blending, the higher your percentage of the pot is going to be. So we've also, because we have so many requirements about what is defined as eligible liquid biofuel, DOER is establishing a list of biofuel suppliers. So we'll kind of be pre-qualifying people that are making biofuel, so that biofuel distributors or wholesalers can reference that list, know that that fuel is going to basically be pre-qualified, can purchase it and sell it on to their end user and be certain that they're going to get AECs for that. So just a few requirements for those suppliers. They have to apply to be included on the list. They have to be a part of the EPA's renewable fuel standard. They have to provide all sorts of documentation to DOER so that we can verify the feedstocks that they're using. And we'll be also doing that on a quarterly basis, looking at what are the feedstocks that they're using and does that meet our definition of eligible liquid biofuel. So biogas and compost heat exchange systems. A biogas system could be anything like an anaerobic digester or a landfill that's using that for a thermal load. Because you would have to have a thermal load on site, it's not like with electricity where you could net meter. The eligible biogas fuel has to be conveyed directly from its source to the generation unit where it's being consumed by a dedicated pipeline. For compost heat exchange systems, these are aerobic biodegeneration of organic matter, so compost piles where they actually have technologies that it can extract the heat from that compost and put it towards a useful thermal load. So woody biomass, woody biomass has the most requirements out of any of the technologies, and that's primarily because in the statute that was passed, the legislature directed DOER to address 5 main areas, and that is emissions performance standards with particular focus on PM 2.5, a 50% reduction in life cycle GHG emissions. There has to be thermal storage or something to help minimize cycling and preserve efficiency. There has to be efficiency standards. And then also in consultation with our sister agency, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, we had to establish sustainable forestry practices. So you can't just be, clear cutting a forest and qualifying that to generate AECs. The wood really has to be coming from a sustainable forestry practice. So getting into some of these more specifically, so the feedstock requirements, we have 4 different categories of feedstock that you can classify: residues, thinnings, forest salvage, non-forest derived residues. Residues and thinnings are really coming directly from the forest. Forest salvage is exactly what it sounds like. If you had an ice storm come through and take down a bunch of trees, you would have to clear that out of the forest anyways, and so that could be used as fuel. And then non-forest derived residues are things like secondary products from a forest products industry. So if you had sawdust from a mill or a wood shop, something like that. In addition, we have a 30% requirement come from the following. So that's pretty much the same as the first block. It's just including utility waste and urban wood waste. And that requirement is because, as an agency, our larger agency, the Environmental and Energy Agency, also has a responsibility to help the forest industry. And so this program, we're hoping, really helps them by having a second market for their forest products. So right now, there's not a whole lot of forest management that's going on in Massachusetts, and that's just because it's very expensive and they don't have anywhere to put the wood that's coming out of that management process. And so this hopefully is going to be a place for them to put that and use it for fuel. But the utility wood waste and urban wood waste has the potential to kind of overshadow that forest product. And so the idea by requiring just a small percentage to come from these categories, it helps the overall agency goal of managing forests and helping the forest industry. So we have, again, emissions performance standards. These are about 3 times lower than the EPA standards, but still very feasible to be met based on the technology that's out there. We do have a lower standard if you're located at a sensitive population, which DOER identifies as a school, a hospital, a nursing home, or we could determine it to be any other facility. You would have to meet a quite lower threshold for your PM 2.5. So 50% reduction in life cycle GHG analysis. We determined that to be over a 30-year time period. The analysis for this trends very closely to the analysis we currently use in our RPS. It's based off of a study we had done a couple years ago all about greenhouse gas emissions in forests. It's based on a couple different factors: efficiency, your load, what fuel you're displacing, what type of biomass fuel you're using, and then what's the feedstock that went into that fuel. This is just a screenshot of the calculator, so you can see the blue cells are cells that you would be required to fill in, and then at the bottom it would spit out for you what is your GHG reduction over 30 years, and then if you're over 50%, like it is here, it would be green. If you were below 50, it would be red, and so it's a useful tool for calculating your GHG emissions. But we know that a lot of smaller systems, homeowners, small commercial systems might not want to complete that analysis. It might be too much for them. They might not understand some of the inputs. So again, similarly to the biofuel suppliers list, in order to provide some simplicity to this program, which it's not very simplistic in its whole, but in this particular spot, we are going to establish a biomass suppliers list where we'll be basically pre-qualifying fuel suppliers to have met all sustainable forestry and GHG requirements. So as a homeowner, you could go to this list, and if you're purchasing fuel from someone, you don't have to worry about the GHG calculator. You don't have to worry about any of the sustainable forestry requirements. It's all been pre-approved for you. And on that list, we'll have a couple different classes, and that's just because when you look at if you're displacing fuel oil versus if you're displacing natural gas, the number of residues that you would need to do that, there's a big difference. So by breaking it up into classes, we provide a little more flexibility to fuel suppliers. If they're, can't get a lot of residues and they're using more thinnings, then maybe they're only qualified for class 3, and they can just sell to people who are displacing fuel oil. But if the residues isn't a problem for them, then they can supply to everyone. It's just giving them a little more flexibility. We do have some thermal storage requirements, but we also have the ability to be exempt from these. So we know thermal storage isn't it's not suitable for everyone. So we do allow for some exemptions on a case-by-case basis if you can really prove to us that your system would be better without thermal storage, or if thermal storage is really going to cause a detriment to your system's efficiency and PM emissions. We have some efficiency standards and just some general requirements. All systems have to be automatically fed. They have to have, fuel storage, feedstock conveyance, all of that. We have to have an 85% efficiency for pellets, 75% for chips. If you're using the European standards to certify your systems, the requirements are a little more stringent. For the efficiency, it would be 80%. Also, in your PM emissions, you have to meet a lower threshold for that as well. We have some fuel quality specifications. So again, fuel quality specifications just give DOER another layer of security as far as your PM emissions and your efficiency. If you're using a better quality fuel, you're going to get a better burn. You're going to have a higher efficiency and less emissions. So if you're a boiler that's under 3 million BTUs, you would have to meet all the specifications listed here unless you installed some sort of emissions control technology. So for some larger systems, utility scale or really large commercial systems, there's a big benefit for them to be able to, for example, use green chips. And so these specifications wouldn't allow you to use green chips. But if you were to install something like an electrostatic precipitator that basically brings your emissions almost virtually to zero, we're going to exempt you from those fuel quality specifications because we know that you're getting virtually no emissions from your system. If you are over 3 million BTUs per hour capacity, the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection actually requires you to get a permit, so they would be working with you on your fuel quality standards, so you don't have to meet anything for us. I'm not going to read this whole slide to you, but this is how DOER established sustainable forestry. We defined it based on the Society of American Foresters definition. It takes into account a lot of different things, biological diversity, soil and water, all of that. We really feel it's an all-encompassing and really valuable definition. There are a couple different pathways for you to certify your sustainable forestry. If you're in Massachusetts, you pretty much have to go through the Department of Conservation and Recreation through a cutting plan. If you're outside of Massachusetts, you can either have a certified or licensed forester help you or be certified to an independent scheme listed here. For the intermediate woody biomass systems, this is the AEC formula that they'll be using. So it's all based on the higher heating value of the fuel, the efficiency of your unit, the amount of fuel delivered. Pretty straightforward. So for example, here, if you had, say you were using pellets, so you had an 8,000 BTU per pound higher heating value, your system is 85% efficient. If you were using about 5 tons a year, which would be 10,000 pounds, you're looking to get about 19 AECs for that quarter. So just generally, qualification procedure, generation units will submit an application to DOER. DOER would review and approve that application. You would need an independent verifier. So this is very common across the portfolio standards, especially in New England where you're reporting to the NEPOOL GIS. An independent verifier is basically an independent third party that reads your meter and verifies the production and then uploads it to the NEPOOL GIS where your certificates are minted. For the small systems and the intermediate biomass systems, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center is actually taking on that role. So for the residential and small commercial systems, they don't have to work with anyone. It's just built in that the Mass CUC will do this for them. If you were an intermediate or larger system, you would need to work with someone, another entity to do that for you. And then once your IV starts reporting production, you would start having your certificates be minted. So our application portal, like I mentioned before, it opened last week. It's also hosted by the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. It's 6 steps. You can save after each step. You can exit after each step. You can have multiple applications open at the same time. It's one of the more functional portals I think I've ever seen. It has a lot of great features in portal communication where DOER can write a note on an application and that updates the applicant that they need to fix something. Automatic email updates anytime your application status changes or if DOER requests more information. This is a screenshot right here of kind of the first step, and just so you can get a look at the aesthetic, and it's really streamlined. I think it's really easy to understand, and we really hope that it's going to help make this application super simple. Since we know the program does have a lot of complexities, we're trying to really pare that down for the application. This you can see is what your queue would look like. So, you'll see in that first row, you have your application. The status is that it needs information, and on the right, you can see DOER has written a note that you need to revise your date of service. So, and then at the below that, you can see all of your other applications where it's actually giving you a tracker and showing how complete each application is. And then this is just DOER's dashboard. Again, it's super flexible, super searchable. It's really a great application portal. We think it's going to help the program run really smoothly. And then just because these slides are being sent out, we included some helpful links. So our regulation, all of our guidelines, which really encompass all of the information I've talked about today, plus more information. If you can believe it, there is more information on this program, more requirements, things like that I didn't cover. And also the application portal is there if you wanted to either submit an application or just go in and check it out and see the functionality if you're looking for ideas if you're starting a program or similarly. So any questions? I think, Warren, you're going to take it from here.
I sure will. Hey, Samantha, thanks very much. You certainly covered a lot of ground there in what's a very complex program. It's very impressive. And we do have a bunch of questions. One is, do you have a sense of what you expect the APE prices to be, or what the range is likely to be?
Yes. So right now, the APS market is about 50% undersupplied. And in situations where the market is very undersupplied, the certificate price trends very closely to the alternative compliance payment, which really acts as a ceiling for prices. So the ACP is if there aren't enough certificates in the market, like we're seeing right now, instead of penalizing entities for not meeting their obligation because there just isn't enough supply, they can just make a one-time flat payment and meet their compliance. So you're never going to sell a certificate usually for over that value because someone's not going to pay $500 for a certificate if they can just make a flat payment for $22. But when you are undersupplied, we see prices track very closely to that ACP level. So right now we're seeing ACE prices are about $20 a certificate.
Okay. And what share of the participants do you expect will be using pre-minting? Is that going to be a lot of the players in this market, or is that going to be a rare thing?
So I think the number of small systems that we'll see, it will probably be the largest share of applications that we get, just because, we expect this to be, more residential, small commercial systems than the larger commercial and industrial systems. So number of systems wise, I think we'll see a lot doing pre-minting, but the percentage of certificates that'll come from those systems won't be as much as you would expect. Even for a 10-year strip, the small systems are only going to be creating, a couple hundred certificates. You could have a large industrial system that's installed that's generating thousands of certificates a year. So as far as number of certificates, I think we'll see primarily small systems, but the percentage of certificates that they'll be generating won't be nearly as much.
Okay, and somebody wanted to ask about how, in terms of the case of ground source heat pumps, where the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center offers a rebate program. How does this initiative intersect with that? Can somebody take advantage of a rebate through the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center and then still sell the certificates?
Yes. So the Clean Energy Center, they offer rebates, upfront funding, and you can participate in both programs. So we've actually been working with the Clean Energy Center over this whole process to try and make our programs match up as closely as possible. There are a few little differences, but I think overall most systems, if you're qualifying for one, you would qualify for the other. The only exception would be for air source heat pumps. The Mass DEC, they provide rebates for mini splits that are just being used as supplemental heating and cooling. For our program, it really needs to be primary heating and cooling, whole home solutions. So that's the only technology that I expect there to be any sort of big difference. But all the other technologies, I would expect most people would participate in both.
And who has the compliance requirement under this whole program? In other words, who is required to purchase the AECs? Is it DOER or Mass CEC, or is it the utilities, or is it each individual electricity supplier?
So it's load serving entities. So that is anyone that is selling electricity into Massachusetts. So you would have your electric or your investor-owned utilities, National Grid, Eversource, all of those. And then you would also have any of your competitive suppliers that are licensed in Massachusetts as well.
And then, you have from this description several factors that it seems like the owner of the system is going to be self-reporting. Things like, in some cases at least, woody biomass feedstocks, or the amount of conditioned space in square feet, or the surface orientation factor. In those cases, who's going to report, who's going to check to see whether the information that's reported by the system owner is actually accurate?
So to clarify, we're actually hoping that homeowners are not submitting applications, and that's just because, you know, the fields that we're asking sometimes are pretty technical, and they just might not be aware of what specifically we're asking. We're hoping to see the market develop where you have either an aggregator submitting an application. You know, we're really stressing the importance of aggregators in this program, especially for the small systems. Aggregators work, you know, with you to get your system qualified. They'll handle the application. They'll work with the installer, get all the information. So you don't even have, the homeowner wouldn't have to worry about that. And then they also sell your certificates for you, which is, you know, is wildly important, especially for these small systems where, you know, you're getting a lump sum of certificates. So if you, one, can't find a buyer for your certificates, or you're selling your certificates for a price way below what everyone else is selling them for, that's only going to lessen the incentive that you're getting. So really, there's a lot of value in working with an aggregator, someone who can sell your certificates and also will get you usually the best price. And so our hope is that the aggregator would be working with the installer to submit the application on the homeowner's behalf. And then as far as verifying a lot of the fields, we're going to be having a pretty comprehensive auditing procedure internally where, you know, we might, you know, DOER reserves the right at any time to go out and inspect a generation unit. So probably doing site visits to systems, following up with installers, asking to see documentation on systems you know, that applications were submitted for. We'll be doing a lot of verification of the information we're receiving.
Well, following up on your emphasis on aggregators, how would a company get to be added to the list of aggregators?
So you can just email me your company information. We don't, you know, we don't certify or approve aggregators. The list is really just a resource we provide to people looking for an aggregator. So anyone that requests to be put on the list, we add. So if you're an aggregator and you're looking to be added to the list, you can just send me an email, include all the fields that are on the list. So company name, contact information, and then for this program, we ask to what type of systems are you looking to aggregate for? So if you're primarily just looking to do small systems or large systems, identify that. If you have any technologies that you're looking to do, so maybe you just want to do biofuel systems, identify that as well. And then if you send it to me, I can get you added pretty quickly.
Great. Unsurprisingly, we have a bunch of questions related to biofuels and biomass. That's always a hot topic. And first one I want to pass on is, does your biomass requirement exclude eligible waste that might be coated with plastics or paints that are fossil-based?
Yes. So all eligible woody biomass has to be clean wood, and clean wood is actually a term that is defined by the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, and so it has to be free of all stains, chemicals, any sort of hazardous materials. It really just needs to be wood. You can't have, you know, wood that's been contaminated with any sort of chemicals that then you're burning in your system. We recognize that would, you know, obviously create a lot of harmful emissions. So everything has to be clean wood.
And how about, do the requirements prevent biofuels that are used to produce both thermal and electricity? Are they prevented from earning credits on both the thermal and electricity side of the RPS?
So we do have systems that you can qualify under both. I'd have to follow up with biofuels. I'm not exactly sure, but I know for like woody biomass, you could either be qualified as a CHP facility, which were already eligible technologies in the APS, or you could choose to be a renewable thermal system and qualify just your thermal production under the APS, and then qualify your electric production under the RPS. So yes, you could qualify both under the different portfolio standards.
And, you know, you had said that no biomass, biofuels, or biogas systems are classified as small. Why did you decide to do that?
So that was to prevent them from getting pre-minted certificates. And the reasoning behind that was because there are so many fuel-related requirements and sustainability requirements. You know, if we were to give a biomass system 10 years of certificates up front, and then, you know, 2 years down the road, they figure out, well, I can buy pellets that are a lot cheaper but don't meet your requirements, and they, you know, switch over and start doing that, DOER has no way to claw back those certificates. So, you know, the sustainability of the biomass is something that we take really seriously, and so we just didn't feel comfortable giving all of those certificates up front. So by classifying them as just intermediate or large, it essentially excludes them from being eligible for the pre-minting. But, you know, they still can use a formula. It's still very simple. They still get, you know, their certificates. One thing I didn't highlight that I think is important is for intermediate and large systems, there's no end date on your qualification. So the 10 years really just applies to small systems, and that's because we needed a time frame to calculate the certificates over. But if you're an intermediate biomass system, even if you're installed in a home, you know, you could be getting certificates for 15, 20 years if that's the life of your system. So there are a lot of benefits associated with being an intermediate and large system. And we actually built in a provision that allows you to size up. So if you were a small system and you think you're going to get better financials from foregoing the pre-minting and getting certificates quarterly based on metering, you can do that. And you then, again, would be eligible past the 10 years of production as long as your system is still operating.
Okay, no, that makes good sense. So it wasn't that you're trying to discourage systems that actually people would think of as small. It's just that you didn't want to classify them as small because of the pre-minting issue.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think we hope to see a lot of these residential, small, commercial-sized biomass systems. You know, that's definitely something that, you know, we would like to see. But yeah, the classification was really just based on the metering protocol for those systems.
Okay. Well, to make sure I get this next question right, I'm going to read it. I'm wondering about the wording in your definition of eligible renewable thermal to the effect that it can be based on naturally occurring temperature differences. This obviously was meant to cover heat pumps, but would seem to exclude most ground source units. Most ground source heat pump loops charge the ground with heat in summer and then in winter recoup much of that heat. In what sense is this relying on a naturally occurring temperature difference?
So I think, you know, the ground is always a certain temperature. I think it's usually consistently around 50 degrees. So, you know, you are using it somewhat as a thermal battery where, like they mentioned, you are putting heat into it and then drawing that heat out. But I think, you know, you could, you know, say the same about the ambient air where, you know, BTUs are never created or destroyed, whether it's the ground or the air or the water. So, you know, I think for our purposes, ground source heat pumps, you know, even if you are adding BTUs and later extracting those, we would still consider that an occurring temperature difference.
Okay. And the next question I wanted to ask, somebody asked if you could go over how CHP systems can participate in the alternative portfolio standard. The person didn't fully follow how you were describing that.
Right. So CHP systems are actually already eligible under this program. They've been eligible, I think, since the APS's inception. And so right now, you can, when you're classified as a CHP system, there's a specific formula that goes into how you calculate your AECs. which is different than the renewable thermal approach. So you could choose to be a CHP system and follow that protocol and that methodology of calculating your AECs, or you could choose, and that when you're a CHP system, that accounts for your thermal and your electric. It's all wrapped up into one. You get your AECs are based on both. But you could alternatively choose to be a renewable thermal system where you're following the renewable thermal protocol just for your useful thermal energy, and you're also an RPS, you'd probably be a class 1 generation unit where you're following that protocol for your electricity. So, you know, in the grand scheme of things, you would be getting an incentive still for both your thermal and your electric. It's just the methodology would be different if you were looking at it together as a CHP or separately as a thermal and a class 1 unit. Okay,
that makes sense. And here's the final question. Will AECs only be accrue to new systems installed after now, or can they be granted to systems that have been installed in previous years?
So the eligibility date is January 1st, 2015. So if you were installed after that, you would be eligible for the program. Anything prior to January 15th would not be eligible.
Okay. Hey, Samantha, you are going to obviously be pretty busy administering this program. It sounds really interesting, and it should have a good impact in incentivizing the market in Massachusetts, and it will be interesting to monitor the results as they come in coming years. So thanks very much for sharing this with us, and we'll look forward to future webinars on other RPS topics. Thanks all of you for listening today.